Welcome to the forum. On behalf of the panel today, it is my great pleasure to welcome to our program two very distinguished members of government. To my far right is the Honorable Cecil Andrews, the Governor of the state of Idaho. Governor Andrews at this time is vying for his second term in that office. As a freshman governor of this state, he became a member of the Executive Committee of the National Governors Conference, and during the same time he served as chairman of the Rocky Mountain Federation of States. Governor Andrews, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, and good afternoon, to our viewing audience when this will be shown.
Our second guest to my immediate right is the Honorable Frank Church, the senior senator from the state of Idaho. Senator Frank Church is seeking his fourth term in the United States Senate, where he serves as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, and the Democratic Steering Committee. He also is chairman of the Senate Special Committee on Aging, and he is also a member and co-chairman of the Senate Special Committee on the termination of the national emergency. Senator Church, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
I'm happy to be with you, believe me.
I also welcome back three regular panel members. To my far left, Professor Richard Hyneman, who has been on leave for the past 2 years, completing his doctorate in communications. Before leaving, he was chairman of the Division of Communications at North Idaho College, and now serves as a professor in that department. Welcome back, Professor Hyneman.
All right, thank you, Tony.
I also welcome back Mrs. Mary Lou Reed, who is a political and community leader in the state of Idaho. She's also well known as a conservationist and environmental expert, and is a former graduate student at Columbia University in New York City. Welcome back, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
And finally, our third regular panel member, Dr. Ken Wright, who is a graduate with his doctorate from the University of Idaho, who now is a professor of chemistry at this institution and chairman of the physical sciences. Welcome back, Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question today from Professor Hyneman.
My question is directed to Governor Andrews. Governor, according to press reports during the past few days, you had originally planned to spend approximately $400,000 in your campaign to secure re-election. But now that you've evidently scaled it down to the neighborhood of $200,000. My question is that if you have any surplus of this $200,000, what do you plan to do with it?
Well, Doctor, number one, the reason it was scaled down tremendously was because we did not anticipate any surplus. As a matter of fact, the way it looks now, we may not even achieve at that point. But permit me to correct one portion of that wire service story that you refer to. We never did plan a budget of $400,000. Our original figure was $250,000, and the $400,000 figure was that amount of money that was expended by now Senator Jim McClure 2 years ago in his campaign, figuring that if it took them $400,000 on that campaign trail in '72, inflation would increase that, but I felt we could do it for a reasonable amount of $250,000. The money has not been forthcoming for a lot of reasons. I think Watergate, people are turned off on politics, the money crunch, inflation, all of these things. The contributions to a political campaign are more difficult to come by, and we'll be very lucky if we get to the $200,000 mark. Any amount left over, we can expand our TV coverage and some other things at the tail end if we have the money.
Thank you. Mrs. Reed.
Senator Church, as chairman of the subcommittee on multinational corporations, you have headed investigations of worldwide operations of corporations, and in particular the oil companies. Can you tell us if you feel that they have acted irresponsibly in this past year?
Well, Lou, I suppose we've made the most thorough investigation of big oil that's ever been made, certainly in the Congress. In fact, it's the first serious investigation that has been undertaken by the Congress. I think that these oil companies have lost their clout in dealing with the oil-producing governments. Now, for many years, it was the oil companies that were in the saddle. And they entered into a whole series of interlocking agreements which really prevented the free market from working in oil. These agreements permitted the oil companies to control both production and price, which they did very effectively for years. But they had some observers, students, if you will, the governments of these oil-producing countries watching them. And it was just a question of time until these governments got together and decided that they could do better what the big oil companies had previously been doing. And they've taken the action away from the oil companies. They've increased the price of oil between 500% and 600%, which is the principal cause of runaway inflation now in the Western world, and as the President has observed, might push us over the brink into another terrible economic catastrophe. But as the money has poured into the treasuries of these oil-producing governments, the oil companies have been there to take their slice off the top. And the thing that worries me is that these companies have had such influence over the years in writing our tax laws that they're escaping practically scot-free. This year, for example, owing to these tremendously high prices, the 5 American-owned big oil companies will realize profits in excess of $8 billion. And yet, they'll be paying income taxes on those fantastic profits at an average rate of between 2% and 4%, while the ordinary working man gets 20 or 25% taken out of his paycheck every second week. Now that's what bothers me. I think that big oil has been getting a free ride, or what's tantamount to a free ride, and that we really do need a comprehensive overhaul of our tax system. If we had that, there'd be no need for the President requesting a 5% surtax to deal with the present inflation.
Now, your subcommittee cannot introduce any sort of tax reform, can it? Is there any legislation that can come through your investigations that will perhaps put pressure on changes?
Yes, I have proposed several bills as a result of this investigation. For one thing, I think that we should impose some sort of minimum tax on any corporation overseas. Not just oil, but all corporations dealing overseas that are getting by paying just a minimal or just a token tax today, or none at all in some cases. Now, we do that with individuals. You know, if you are a rich individual and take advantage of all the loopholes in the law in such a way that you escape taxation, there is a clause in the present Internal Revenue Code that says there's a minimum tax you must pay anyhow, you see. I think there should be a minimum tax that these big corporations should pay anyhow, even if they can manage to take advantage of all the other concessions in the law. That's one bill that I proposed. Another bill, directly relating to oil, would give the government a role to play in approving long-term contracts between these big companies on the one hand and the foreign governments that they deal with on the other. As things now stand, our own government has no way to protect the American people. The contracts are made between the companies and the foreign governments. And I think that in view of the inflationary impact of these prices, our own government should have some role to play.
Dr. Wright.
I would like to address my first question to Mr. Church. Senator, the Hells Canyon area is an area of Idaho that's particularly interesting to Idahoans for a number of reasons. The Hells Canyon bill, which you helped sponsor in the Senate, has made it through the Senate now and I believe is presently in House committee. What do you think are the prospects for this bill getting out of House committee, and do you think it can possibly pass the House this session? And do you think that the people of Idaho really want to see Hells Canyon made into a national recreation area in light of our energy crunch in the past and what we are certain to face in the future?
Oh yes, I think the people of Idaho are not so easily panicked. They know that Hells Canyon is going to be there for a long time, and that we can either lock it up behind a high dam and ruin the last remaining undeveloped stretch of that river through the deepest gorge on the continent. Or we can recognize that we have to find alternate sources of power anyway. You build a dam down there, and what is it, Governor? It gives us 14 or 16 months of extra of extra power, and then it's over. And that's why I've appreciated the strong support that the governor has given me, and we've worked very closely together in trying to get this bill enacted. It's the power would be drained away from Idaho if the dam were built, 90% of it. And this is a unique asset for our state, this canyon, and we ought to keep it that way. The prospects in the House are clouded. Congressman Sims opposes the bill. Congressman Ullman, however, who represents the district on the opposite side of the river from Oregon, equally interested in the subject, favors the bill. Now, Sims is on the Interior Committee, Ullman is not. Hyneman is a very influential member of the Congress, however. So I'm looking at that picture with considerable interest and hoping for the best. Governor, I think you probably would like to...
I'd like to make one point, Doctor, if I may, with regards to that. Normally, the type of legislation that is care legislation, that we care about, the people care about, Senator Church has been able to, with his stewardship of the legislation, get it through the Senate. But year after year and time after time, we run into the situation where the House of Representatives or a member of the House has a tendency to tie up the legislation. So our battle is in the House. I think Mr. Taylor is the chairman of that committee, is he not, Frank?
Yes.
He understands the problems that we see, but I think there's been decided improvements in that bill from the time that it was originally drafted and in its present state with regards to boundaries. I think it's a good piece of legislation. I think that it should pass with a heavy majority of approval votes in the House, and when it does, then that stretch of the Snake River will remain free-flowing with all of the benefits that can be accrued to that. And the point that Senator Church made, I think, is very appropriate in this situation, is that if you looked on a chart, a power chart, the amount of power that would be generated in that area is very small when it's compared to the entire need of the nation or the area. We're going to have to look for alternate sources. I say to you, and I say to anybody that happens to be watching this program, then instead of destroying that for all times behind a large chunk of concrete and hundreds of feet of water, that we have to look to alternate sources anyway. Let's do it now and produce generate the amount of electricity to be produced by some other means.
Agreed. Emphatically agreed.
Governor Andrus, I have a question for you in relation to the campaign that you are now waging with your opponents for the governorship. And very recently, the third-party candidate for governor charged that the state is in a deficit very recently, yet reports I've read for the past few years that at the end of the fiscal year we have a surplus. We have these different reports. Would you, as governor and chief executive, state to us the physical condition of the state and the budgetary process as of not only the present time but the past 3 or 4 years?
Well, let's go back to 1971 when I became governor of the state of Idaho. We were in a situation at that point in time where there was a projected deficit, and maybe this is what the independent party candidate is talking about 4 years ago. That has been closed. We are in a balanced position fiscally in the state of Idaho. We ended the June 30, 1974 fiscal year, as we did in 73, with literally no state debt, with a balanced budget, all of our bills paid, a cash position, and a modest surplus. And the modest surplus that we have now is being returned to the people in the form of property tax relief and the purchasing of the parklands for the school endowment funds. So we're in a strong position, and I might add that Idaho is one of the top 3 states in the nation as far as being fiscally sound. Also, from the area of increase in personal income, we were number 3 in the nation last year in increase in personal income. We're number 2 this year. Our economic growth has been ahead of the inflationary percentages and spirals. It's helped us to maintain our level of employment and quality of life of our people, where other states have not. But as Senator Church pointed out a moment ago, the inflationary aspects that are striking the world today, we're not immune from them. It's hurting us. We're having large layoffs of personnel in the lumbering and logging industry. Some of the others will follow if they do not get the home building starts back to at least 1.6 or 1.8 million starts per year. And that's finance, that's interest rates, that's availability of money, and I'd love to go into it if you want to and have time, but maybe I better wait and see if we get a question.
May I pursue that one step further? It seems that, first of all, you surveyed the present economic condition of a balanced budget and growth and so forth, but you hinted at projections for the future, and with the inflationary rate of the country and also increase in unemployment and how that affects some industries in this state, such as the lumber industry. What do you see as our, first of all, risk, and secondly, what particular concrete programs do you propose, or maybe Senator Church would like to respond to at the national level in relation to this projected problem, if I sense what you're saying as a problem?
Right. It is a problem. Inflation is a problem in every country of the world, in the United States, across the board in all states, and in Idaho, one of the 50 states. To combat it, the solutions will not be made entirely at the local level, but we can contribute to it. I do not think at the lower salary levels that an increase in taxes is a means of fighting inflation, because if you increase the taxes or take more money away from the people, you've decreased their purchasing power of that family unit. At the same time, the costs are going up, and you've compounded the problem. So there will be no general fund tax increases in the state of Idaho in the next year if I am reelected governor of the state. That's one thing that we can do. Maintain our budget, and I mean our programs and budget in the state at a level where we can care for some of these women and children who will need help because of inflation. You can't ignore the fact that as the economy dips off, we have social and economic problems internally in the state that cannot be ignored. And if the Congress of the United States, and maybe Frank would like to mention this, if they find it necessary to lop off some of the funds that we receive for education or general revenue sharing, all they've done is to pass that problem down the line to the state, where you have to then pick it up, and you haven't helped inflation at all. But I think it's important that we look at some of the foreign aid and the situation of $200 and some million to Turkey, where we're sending the country of Turkey tanks and guns, and they're sending us heroin. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me at all, and you get into your foreign aid and your balance of payments. I think we're going to have to lop off some of this foreign aid. I know Senator Church worked to decrease the foreign aid bill by $5 billion. He was successful. I applaud his efforts in this regard. I just say, Frank, that wasn't enough. Where are you going from here?
Well, I agree with you, Governor. I'd like to lop off the whole program as it's presently administered, because it has so little to do with aiding people that need the help. You know, it's a program that largely has to do with financing the budgets and arming many foreign governments that have nothing in common with us. Most of them are dictatorships. Most of them are not really vital to our own security. And the program, I think, has outgrown its usefulness. But if I can't get the votes to kill the program outright, then the next best thing I can do is try to cut it down in cost.
I agree.
Yeah. On the question of inflation, at the national level, I think that several things will have to be done. I don't believe that President Ford has given us an adequate program, or even a very good program. I take issue, for example, with the 5% surtax for the same reasons that the governor mentioned. And I think we're going to need more than win buttons. You know, this is it's all right to say, let's fight, let's win, let's beat inflation. But this is a very pervasive and complex inflation, the worst in memory, and it's going to take more than that. Yes, I agree, it must take drastic cutbacks in foreign spending. We will balance the budget. The Congress, I've always contended, would balance the budget once we got a president who would submit a balanced budget, and I assume now that President Ford will do this. We used to hear lots of brave talk from his predecessor about fiscal responsibility, but Mr. Nixon submitted a whole series of budgets that were anywhere from $15 to $20 billion in the red every year. And his became the biggest spending administration since the Second World War. Well, a balanced budget will help. Beyond that, we've got to cope with the question of these high fuel prices. And the only thing that I know that represents a long-term solution to that problem is a real crash program to make ourselves much more self-sufficient in fuel. Now, we've had lots of talk, but we haven't had much action. And I can remember we had a crash program in the Second World War that developed the atomic bomb, for better or for worse. It happened. When the Russians put a little Sputnik up there in orbit, we had such a panic in this country that we spent $25 billion to get to the moon before they got there. That was a crash program. So we've demonstrated that we're capable of getting things done with crash programs. Now, for heaven's sakes, if the President will follow through with a crash program for developing new forms of energy resources and making our country less dependent upon foreign sources for fuel, that certainly is a part of the mix in dealing with this persistent inflation.
Professor Hyneman.
I have two quick questions for Senator Church. The first one, Senator, is would you agree with a statement made last week by Congressman John Moss of California that Richard Nixon should now be considered a security risk and should not be continued to be briefed every 10 days on foreign policy?
I don't see any reason why it's any longer necessary to continue to brief Mr. Nixon on the state secrets. After all, I don't see any national purpose in it anymore. I don't think he has plans to come back and run again, and normally these briefings have been reserved to either the President or to a candidate for the presidency, so that he may at least know enough about the secret aspects of ongoing diplomacy so as not to embarrass the country inadvertently in the course of his campaign. And beyond that, I see no necessity. Why Mr. Nixon continues to receive these briefings is beyond me.
Well, now, Time magazine reported that these briefings cost approximately $6,500. If that is correct, why would it cost $6,500 to fly out from Washington, D.C. to San Clemente to brief the President? What's the cost factor?
I don't understand anything about the cost factors dealing with Mr. Nixon in his retirement. The last time that the Congress began to calculate all this in recent hearings, you know, the total cost, directly and indirectly, of various kinds of staff and personnel and maids and butlers and chauffeurs and lawn people, gardeners, housekeepers, staff, office, it's somewhere up in the neighborhood of $1 million or more. Continuing Secret Service. Some of it is, of course, proper and necessary. But when the transitional costs for Nixon were double those that had ever been asked for any of his predecessors, and when you consider he didn't leave office under the most honorable of circumstances, I'm at a loss to justify these requests. But I understand that he is his most persistent advocate. He's on the phone all the time, lining things up. And the last thing I heard was that he'd gotten a hold of Mr. Schlesinger, the Secretary of Defense, to line up a wave in the Navy who has secretarial experience for Mrs. Nixon. And this is just a part of a pattern. I don't want to exclude Mrs. Nixon. If Mr. Nixon is going to have all the rest, maybe she needs some help too. But there just is no justification for the scale, the cost, the extravagance of all these arrangements.
Once you've been king, it's difficult to break the habit.
I expect that's it. And the thing that I find it puzzling to understand is how he's getting away with it. And I do think the Congress will cut back these requests very substantially.
My second question was referring to the nomination of Nelson Rockefeller. Now, in view of the revelations the past few days that Lawrence Rockefeller put up $60,000 to underwrite a book written by Victor Lasky that was derogatory to Arthur Goldberg. As of today, Or now, would you vote to support the nomination of Nelson Rockefeller for vice president?
Well, I couldn't say as of now that I'd vote against him, but I'm very much troubled about the Lasky book, mainly because I have such respect for Mr. Goldberg. He's a very close personal friend of mine, and so I'm offended by this. But even though Mr. Rockefeller would not have been my choice for vice president, I think the hearings will have to turn up something that plainly disqualifies him from serving. And the gifts raise certain questions. This book raises certain questions, but as yet I couldn't honestly say that the evidence is such as to plainly disqualify him from serving as vice president.
May I throw in one point there, Professor, in that I would hope that in America that we would not hold our brother's actions against the candidate, in that I have a brother who is a well-known Republican in the circles in which he lives, and I would hate to have Steve's actions held against me, so I think they're going to have to narrow in on Nelson himself.
All right, thank you.
Mrs. Reed.
Could we get back to these crash programs on energy? As you know, Project Independence is really pretty scary to the Rocky Mountain states because they have the possibility of really being ripped up for coal. And now we're having it kind of edge into Idaho with Idaho Power's project to build a coal-fired plant south of Boise. Is there any way that we can legislate nationally and on the state level for conservation of energy to make sure that we aren't going to destroy the environment while we're at it?
Well, at the national level, let me just lead off by saying that the really effective measure that would conserve fuel in a magnitude that matters is forcing Detroit to wake up to the fact that we're living in a different world. Now, if they're going to continue to build monstrous gas-guzzling automobiles of 365 horsepower that are only 7% efficient, and then spend millions of dollars advertising them so that the American people are induced or impelled to buy them, we're not going to conserve gasoline in sufficient quantities to matter. The average American manufactured automobile is getting 13 miles per gallon. Now, that's not because of the devices we've put on them, anti-pollutant devices. I know that campaign is very widely believed, and it's been so well conducted that a lot of people believe it. But actually, the 1975 models with these anti-pollutant devices are 13% more efficient in gasoline consumption than the year before. And President Ford says we want to make further progress in making our cars more efficient, and of course we must do that. But I doubt that it'll be done voluntarily. I think that given the progress to date, Congress must consider some kind of legislation in this field.
Dr. Wright.
I want to pursue the question of our economy a little bit more, since that seems to be the #1 topic. Your opponent, Senator Church, in this campaign have indicated repeatedly that one of their strong arguments is that if we simply will get government out of the way, that our free enterprise system, if we can, it'll operate effectively and pull us out of any depression that we may be headed for. The question I have here is, first of all, do you believe that our free enterprise system really can help solve our problems if we will leave it alone? And after your experiences with the oil companies, do you think we have, is there such a thing in America anymore as true competition? Do we still live in the same world?
I wish we could throw off so many of these myths. I hear the ideologues talking about this free enterprise system as though it were still functioning today the way it was when I was a boy. I believe strongly in the free enterprise system too. And yet when I look about my own hometown, nearly everything that was home-owned when I was a boy is now a part of big national chain of some kind. So that the system has changed, and we have to deal with it as we find it today. There is no free market in international oil. It's useless to talk about the principles of the free market bringing down the price when the price is being determined by a group of governments that have organized themselves into a political cartel. What does the present price of oil have to do with the economics of oil? It costs 25 cents to raise a barrel of oil in Saudi Arabia, and the posted price today for that barrel of oil is $11.65. You see, it's not the economics that are working here, it's politics that are at work. So unless you have people who are willing and able to recognize realities and to try and deal with problems on a pragmatic basis, we'll never get them solved. I know the appeal of the right-wing philosophy to many people in this state. It kind of gets them back to pioneer times, and we all have a very strong and affectionate place in our heart for those pioneer days. But they approach the solution of present-day problems the same way that Marxists do, by attempting to impose an ideology upon the problem and then make the problem conform with the ideology. You can't solve problems that way. You've got to look at the realities, then try to cope in a pragmatic way with those realities. Have I answered your question?
Are you stating then that we really don't have a good workable free enterprise system in this country anymore that can solve our problems if we leave it unregulated?
I'm saying that in certain sectors we do not. International oil being one of them. There's very limited competition among the big industries, the automobile industry, for example. Where's the real competition there? At the retail level, we still have a large measure of competition. And on the farm, there's the last free enterpriser in large numbers, and I'd like to see us keep him there and keep him healthy. In other words, every part of the old free enterprise system that we can preserve, I'm for preserving. But at the same time, we have to recognize the changes that have taken place.
May I give you an example of what the senator is saying that affects Idaho directly and the viewing marketplace that this program will be aired? Our beef industry and our dairy industry are suffering right now. As a matter of fact, the dairy industry in our state will be extinct if the things continue as they are. The cattle industry is suffering. We know that. We have an oversupply for the consumer demand at the present time when you add it all up. And we can solve that. We can live with it if the cattlemen are given steady financing and are not forced to dump their herds on the marketplace and take a tremendous loss. And we'll come out of it. But I think the heart of your question really spoke to some of these simple answers to complex problems that some politicians are glib enough to come up with, and they say, I'm for the law of supply and demand. Simple statement. So am I, and I think so are you as a panelist. But the demand is there, and then government messes with the supply. I'll give you an example. The dairy farmers in this state are hurting because of the importation of dairy products and cheeses from outside of the marketplace. The import quota that's been allowed in the past has been 10 million pounds per year of cheese. The first 6 months of 1974, that was increased tenfold. 100 million pounds of cheese came into America from outside our boundaries to compete with our dairy farmers who were producing dairy products. So the demand was constant, but government messed with the supply, and it just won't work. And beef the same way. New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, they're dumping their products in our country where we have a demand and a supply, but you can't make the two of them balance because of the drastic imports that are coming in over here and forcing our people out of the marketplace. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's right. And I'm provincial enough to think that we have to take care of our own first. So when government dabbles in it, you've got problems.
I'd like to just add a footnote to what the governor has said here. I was down in Minidoka County talking to a whole group of dairy farmers because their problems are very real. And there was several others on the platform, and they kept condemning the government and saying the answer is to get the government out of all of this. But the governor is pointing to governmental action that has been wrong for the dairy farmer. And if you look at the dairy farmer's own recommended cure, it doesn't have to do with getting the government out. It has to do with changing governmental policy to a different policy. And that's what's been wrong has been governmental policy that has worked against maintaining a healthy dairy industry and a healthy cattle situation in this country. And that, in the long run, is against the best interests of the consumer, too, because if we have to start depending on foreign countries for our food, we'll be in the same shape that we're in today, depending on foreign countries for our oil.
Governor Andrus, I'd like to pursue a question with you on another subject, and then I have one for Senator Church, maybe my last turn before I return to the panel and the conclusion of the program. Something that you talked about very much when you became governor was reorganizing state government, and you worked with the legislature, and it was presented to the voters, and the voters approved the plan, and then there was, according to news media, some controversy between various aspects of state government on how to bring it about. But is it not true that we have taken our state government and reorganized it from over 270 boards and departments and commissions into 20? If that's true, would you briefly explain how that was done, and most importantly of all, how is it working?
I think it's working very well, and I will try to stay within the brief guidelines that you have. I see our time is fleeting. But reorganization came about from taking 268 boards and commissions and reducing it to 19 now. The constitutional amendment said no more than 20. It ended up 19. It's not a magic number. It can be decreased further. It can be increased to 20. It was my suggestion and our planning that brought it about in the first place. We proposed a constitutional amendment which the Idaho legislature approved by a 2/3 vote. It went to the people. They approved it overwhelmingly. Came back then for implementation at the legislature. We made the proposal, and that was put together with a legislative interim committee that was headed by Senator Warren Brown, a Republican who is a whale of a good man in the legislature. His committee studied it, our recommendations, the legislative ones. They came up with the proposal that created the 19. We now have 6 months to implement it from July 1 of 74 to January 1. We're ahead of schedule. It's going extremely well. I think it'll be beneficial to the people of the state of Idaho. It really honestly can't be judged for several years to come, but already it's easier for the people to work their way through a maze. Before, you had 268 different places to pass the buck. Now you've got 19, and I guess maybe I'm the 20th one when it gets to me, but nevertheless we can get a handle on it. It's more responsive to the people, and I think it's a decided improvement. I would just say this: even our detractors, the people who for partisan political reasons took after us at the time, are shaking their heads and say, well, it is working better than I thought it would. So I think we have a good story to tell. The people's wisdom in approving it at the polls paid off.
And Senator Church, a question for you. According to news releases I see and information from the Congress, I believe you're a co-chairman with Senator Mathias of Maryland, a Republican, of a Senate Special Committee on the termination of the National Emergency. And I also understand that you've met with the President of the United States to talk about this. What is the situation about your investigation? What kind of legislation did you find giving national emergency powers to the President, and have those been rescinded, or are they still with the President from past history?
Well, I'll see if I can do as good a job as Cease did on his reorganization, because this is also a reorganization at the federal level. We became aware in the aftermath of the Vietnam War of all kinds of ways that Congress was being circumvented, and usually through the use of some emergency power. And so we decided that we'd better take a very careful look at these emergency powers and find out just what had happened in the past 40 years. A special bipartisan committee was formed. I was designated as the chairman for the Democrats, and Mathias as chairman for the Republicans. And we've conducted a very bipartisan investigation for a year and a half. And what we discovered was that not only had a vast amount of power been delegated from the Congress to the President in the past 40 years of war and emergency, enough power that if the President chose to invoke it all, he could run this country as a one-man dictatorship. He could move in on private property, he could inhibit communications, he could control travel. There's just hardly anything that has not been delegated to him in the guise of an emergency power. All right. We also found out that we've been living in an uninterrupted state of national emergency since 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt declared an emergency during the bank holiday. And there have been 3 more emergencies declared since then, all of which are still in existence, though the actual conditions that justified the emergency at the time have long since passed into history. What have we done about it? Well, first of all, we have passed in the Senate an act that I think will one day be looked back upon as a very important piece of legislation. It's called the National Emergencies Act. 1 year from the date of its enactment, it will repeal or terminate all existing states of national emergency. That's number 1. 2, it will provide procedures for future national emergencies so that they can't remain open-ended, and that Congress will have something to say in their creation, and that they will only last 6 months at a time and can't be extended without affirmative congressional action. And 3, about 50 obsolete emergency statutes will be stricken from the books. I think the prospects are excellent. President Ford is cooperative, and the House of Representatives seems also anxious to pass the bill.
Thank you. Professor Hyneman.
We'll change the pace here. I have a question for Senator Church. Recent polls show that both you, Senator, and Governor Andrus enjoy a very comfortable lead for re-election. And initially, as part of your campaign strategy, both of you men were running somewhat as a team, as evidenced by the television commercials and Boys of the Summer and so on. I have noticed in recent weeks that now there seems to be a slight shift, that Governor Andrus seems to be campaigning a little harder for John Evans, as evidenced by the buttons on your lapels.
I was hoping you'd notice that.
And
I'm wearing the same button.
I know it, and Mr. Truby and so on. Senator, are you following the same suit as far as helping Max Hansen and J. Ray Cox?
Yes, and I'm very hopeful that we might succeed in the effort. I think J. Ray Cox would make a fine congressman for Northern Idaho, and he certainly would be more affirmative in his approach to the needs of the district and its people. In southern Idaho, Max Hansen is a man that has had a good deal of public experience in the legislature and is director of the Farmers Home Administration, and he's well qualified, and I'm doing everything I can for him in that part of the state. As a matter of fact, this has been a united team, hasn't it, Governor? The whole ticket. We've all tried to stand together because we're very proud of the ticket this year.
We've got an excellent team to present to the people this year, Professor, and hopefully they'll recognize from top to bottom Senator Church, Congressman Cox, or Congressman Hansen, depending on the district, myself. Somebody else will have to judge that one. John Evans and Tony Park, Marjorie Ruth Moon, Roy Truby, State Auditor Joe Williams, a whole bunch. I'm proud to be a part of it. I made no bones about it. And yes, I'm working for the entire ticket. I hope you're right on that margin, by the way.
My other question, and Governor, you were very prominent in the deliberations taken in Seattle at the National Governors Conference last June. My question, what specifically do you feel that the governors can do or are now doing to make their voices better heard in Washington? Were any specific courses of action instituted at that conference that you partaked in?
Yes, basically I think the governors of the states of this nation realized that and the polls very clearly pointed out, that the public, the general public, Mr. and Mrs. Idaho and Mr. and Mrs. every other state of the union, have lost confidence in, sorry about this, Frank, but some members of Congress and the executive branch at the federal level. Those ratings were way down in the polls. The State House ratings were higher. the people have recognized that that government is strong and it is good in the states. We, the governors, have been a little reluctant collectively in the past to exercise our weight at the national level. We've left it to the congressional branch more than I think we should have, but nevertheless, we did it ourselves in years gone by. The governors have recognized that they do speak with strength when they speak collectively, without respect to party lines in the National Governors Conference. So in the area of human resources, a committee of which I chair, which is the largest committee of that conference, we have been testifying and helping to draft legislation to cure the problems in the states, and we have not left it up to the whim of bureaucratic bill drafters on the Hill. Now, Congress still has their constitutional duty to act on it, but we have a voice there. I think that that is one prime example. Another example, if I may very quickly, we have a steelhead problem on the Clearwater, Salmon, and Snake rivers of this state. The lack of the anadromous fishery returning to its spawning ground and being taken in part by sports fishermen en route because of the gill netting or commercial fishing on the lower Columbia. We tried among the states to resolve this. We couldn't do it. Now we're being forced to go to the federal level, and I think it's proper that we do. I have asked Senator Magnuson to amend his legislation. He has a bill extending the commercial fishing rights or the territorial fishing rights from 18 miles to 200 miles off the coast. I've said to Senator Magnuson that amend that bill to give the commercial fishermen the other 188 miles in the ocean, but take them out of fresh water. And that any time a fish, an anadromous fishery, a salmon or steelhead, arrive at fresh water, it's my feeling they should be taken only by a rod and reel. So that is a justifiable move by the governors to the Congress of the United States. I use that as one example, but the clout is there. We've learned to use it, and we're going to use it, but we do not mean to imply to the good senator here or any other that we're smarter than they are. We just would like to have a little more voice in what you do to us.
Let me just say in that connection that it's not surprising that the polls should show what the governor has mentioned. After all, we've come through a very bleak period of desperately bad executive leadership in Washington. And when you have a president of the United States forced to resign in the face of certain impeachment and probable conviction, when you have a vice president who's forced to resign in the shadow of the criminal courts, this sets a tone of exasperation and disillusionment throughout the country that reflects on the whole federal structure. Whenever you have a popular president, you'll find that the polls show that not only the president but the Congress rates very high. It was interesting for me to notice that after the Judiciary Committee did its job with such a high degree of competence and sense of responsibility, and the American people watched this, had a chance to see a congressional committee in action for a change instead of just hearing it disparaged in the press, that the public respect for the Congress jumped up 18 points in the immediate aftermath of those hearings. So we've been in a very bad period, and I do hope that with a new president, we can put all this behind us, because it's terribly important for the survival of free government in this country that the general level of respect for government and the political process should improve.
Mrs. Reed.
Could we follow up on some of these campaign questions that Dick mentioned? Governor, would you like to tell us why you think it's important to have a lieutenant governor and attorney general of your own persuasion, for instance, on the land board?
All right, let me first speak one at a time, if I may, to the lieutenant governor race that Dr. Hyneman mentioned a moment ago. I think it's vitally important, and I speak from experience, that the governor and lieutenant governor be of the same political party or at least friendly persuasion, because you're supposed to work together as a team. And in this situation, I have endorsed John Evans very strongly. I've been campaigning for John because I know him. He's honest. He has experience of 14 years in the Idaho legislature. 6 of those years in the leadership roles. He's a successful businessman in his own right. He knows what it takes to not only make family life and city government work. He's been in the legislature. If you have a political adversary in that position, the people don't gain from it because they're constantly poking sticks, taking the other tack, muddying up the water. You cannot assign the duties to them that you can the other way. That would be like expecting Jerry Ford, our president, to work with a Democratic vice president who he knew was running for his job. Now, there's just no way you can make that compatible. Look at my present situation. Who is my opponent in this election? The same man who's been my lieutenant governor for 4 years, and I don't believe has ever agreed with me once. So the people are really being shortchanged. If you're talking about a watchdog, Lou, Mrs. Reed, then what you're saying, you've got the legislative branch of government watching the executive and the judicial watching both of them if that's what they want is a watchdog on a pillar, but I don't think that's what they're after. I think it's vitally important. Now, seated on the land board, if we should, the Democrats, lose the control of the land board, I think you can see the return to what it was before we took over. Some of the key cattlemen, sheepmen, livestock people of the state have made millions of dollars off of the grazing leases of state land in the past because of low rates. I can point with a certain amount of pride that the endowment fund return has tripled in 3 years of the new land board. We had about $375,000 going into it in calendar year 70. We'll exceed $1 million this year, and we haven't put anybody out of business. I think it's important because the land board is comprised of, by law, the governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, and the state auditor. Now, you win an election and you have that hat, but you also get another hat that you wear on land board days. And if we would lose one of those and the balance would go the other way, I think some of you I know are firsthand familiar with some of the problems of the land board, the management of the endowment funds for education, the management of state lands, which ones will be preserved for future generations, which ones will be sold for home sites, and this and that. So it's vitally important, I think, that we watch that race. If I may take 15 seconds and say the Attorney General, we've got a good lawyer as Attorney General. There's 750 different decisions come out of his office in 3.5 years, which is an all-time record. And only 3 of those have been overturned by the courts. That average is better than the history of any Attorney General, better than Ivory Snow or anything you want to name. So as a lawyer, I think he deserves to be returned. Dr. Wright.
I've got a raft of questions here that I would dearly love to ask, but I know that Tony would cut me off before I even got a good start on it, so I have had to select. Governor Andrus, I'd like to ask you a question regarding the land use in Idaho. The interim committee of the Idaho State Legislature determined the people of Idaho wanted some kind of a land use planning bill. I'd like to ask you, why didn't we get it? And I'd also like to ask you, why can't we get a bottle bill in this state when the people of Oregon, I'm originally from Oregon, and my friends there like it, and I believe most of the people of Oregon are highly satisfied with it, and we're facing energy problems, and the experts tell us that this is one way to save energy. Why can't we get it in Idaho?
I'll be as brief as I can, Doctor, so that we can cover more of your questions. But number one, the answer to both questions is the legislature has refused to pass both of them. I have recommended the type of legislation to the legislature on two different occasions, the 73 session, the 74 session. In 73, they didn't like my version of the land use planning legislation, so we together agreed to put together a committee of legislators to study old Senate Bill 1111, which I introduced, and the new package of 4 that came out of their studies. They added to it, and I would say they improved it. The funny thing is, the chairman of that interim committee was Senator David Bivens, who helped put it all together and has been supporting it. He's now campaign chairman for my opponent this time, and my opponent is opposing land use planning on the basis of what we came up with. So it makes you wonder, a strange bedfellow thing, I guess, that you hear. But nevertheless, it's needed. I think you got to remember it's got to be locally oriented, locally controlled, state-assisted land use planning. And the Professor Hyneman a moment ago mentioned why do things go to Congress? well, you eventually get frustrated from trying to pass it in a state legislature where it should, and you end up in the congressional halls. So we need it in this state, and we came close last year. It was a 17-17 tie in the Senate that killed the legislation. It will be back this year. If I am giving the state of the state message, as I hope to, I will recommend it once again. And we will, the people had every opportunity for input. They had 13 hearings around the state it was drafted. The bottle bill or container bill, the garbage bill as you talk about it, Oregon has passed theirs. I think you'll see one passed this year. It's been before the legislature 3 times, and they've refused to pass it. I think it'll be copied after the Oregon bill with a slight cleanup.
Senator Church, we're running very much out of time, and I want to get one quick question into you as chairman of the Senate Special Committee on Aging. I attended a committee hearing that you presided over in which some statistics were revealed that some of our retired people are on such low incomes as $149, $150 a month and have medical bills and a home to keep up. And with the inflationary spiral we have, how are they going to make it? And very quickly, what are we going to do about it?
Well, we've got to continue to improve the retirement program and also the Medicare program. I have a bill in the Senate now that would cover out-of-hospital prescription drugs. And if there's one gap we can close in Medicare that would really make a lot of difference, it's that one. I hope I can get it through. I think in time I can.
With that, gentlemen, I'm so sorry to say that we have run out of time. Each week it seems the clock goes faster. Ladies and gentlemen, our 2 guests today have been the Honorable Cecil Andrus, Governor of the state of Idaho, and the Honorable Frank Church, United States Senator representing the state of Idaho. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you on our program.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure being with you.
I also thank Professor Hyneman, Mrs. Mary Lou Reed, and Dr. Ken Wright for outstanding questions. I want to also inform you that next week at this time on our program, our guests will be other candidates, this time of the American Party, for the election in 1974. Thank you for viewing.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording. Good evening.